Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Crypto Hipster Podcast. This is your host, Jamil Hassan, the Crypto Hipster, where I bring you founders, entrepreneurs, executives, thought leaders, co-founders, artists, you name it. Today is the day of an artist. Well, at least, an entrepreneur and an amazing guest. So we're going to find out more about him. My guest today, and I didn't ask him how to pronounce his last name, but we're going to see how I did. His name is Zain Taliarkin.
Perfect.
Awesome.
Yep.
He's CEO of Notable Art. Zain, welcome.
Jamil, thank you. Thank you very much for having me, and thank you to all your listeners. Looking forward to a spirited conversation between and among us today.
Awesome. I'm glad I got your last name right, too. So let's kick things off and ask you first, what's your background, and is it a logical background for what you're doing now?
Absolutely. So very much a pleasure, as I said, to be here. My background is very much from the art world. I grew up in New York and had the great pleasure and privilege of growing up in a collecting family. Collected everything from Indian antiquities to digital art, starting some 20 years ago. Digital art 20 years ago, and then I, after university, worked for Christie's auction house for around 10 years. In a variety of business development, primarily roles. First, starting up the auction houses, brick and mortar auctions in India, working with ultra high net worth collectors out there. Then moved over to spend more time in the Middle East, primarily based out of Dubai, with travel, in the region, working on Christie's auctions out in the Middle East. And then spent my final 4 years with Christie's, actually in Moscow, from 2015 to 2019, running Christie's Russia and sort of wider CIS. Now I find myself in the blockchain, digital art, NFT space, which is certainly it's certainly a change, a very exciting change, which we all know has been on the rise. Certainly, digital art stroke NFTs. In the past couple of years, a little bit of a winter across the broader crypto NFT space, which certainly seems to be thawing, certainly in the past couple of days, if not weeks. But as I said, my personal and professional background is very much from what I'd say is the traditional art world. So what we're doing at Notable is, and I'd like to say, be so bold as to say, unlike other NFT marketplaces and startups, is partnering with both commercially and curatorially successful visual artists to bring their work and their practice to what I and we all feel is the next logical art medium, which is digital. So, of course, there's generative art, AI-driven art, and there are plenty of platforms that do that, and some that do that very, very well. Where I saw, and my team has seen, a gap in the market is with visual artists who are, let's say, a little bit more traditionally educated, or perhaps a little bit older if they're mid to senior career artists who've had them financially and institutionally. How do they bridge the gap and bring their work into the digital space? You need to work with a partner like Notable, which is sort of built by the art world for the art world, but very much an arts company driven by cutting edge technology to work with artists, not only to take their existing inventory and put it on the blockchain and therefore reach a much more broader audience, but working with those artists hand in hand with his or her studio to create new digital first representations of their original artwork. And each one of our unique NFTs is backed by a one-of-one museum quality complementary print.
Interesting. You brought up something I hadn't considered asking, but it is an issue. Or at least it could be. It is. Going from visual to digital, a lot of artists are afraid to do that, or they don't know how. Right?
Absolutely. And there's in addition, so there's a fear aspect and a more educational aspect. How do I do that from a practical point of view? But furthermore, and this is a bit, I think, where fear for a traditional artist and his or her galleries and studio comes from, is how do I not cannibalize or, in worst case scenario, devalue my physical works? To give you an example, Jamil, the first artist whom notable we launched last month, Hans Slonim, who's a very important, prolific neo-expressionist New York-based artist who's had, commercial success and curatorial success over some 50 years of practicing. His works can go from, $6,500 to $200,000, $300,000 plus on the primary market purchasing from the studio. And the NFTs and complementary physical prints of his that we're selling are at $1,500. So there's one could be concerned, but the way that Noble was partnering with the artist is that none of the works, the NFTs that we're producing, are replicas of an original artwork either owned by a collector, let's say yourself, Jamil, or is actually inventory stroke stock that's sitting in the studio or with the galleries. So we're creating new works to complement and make it at a, let's say, a more accessible price point to bring in a new generation of collectors who might have appreciation, let's say, for Hunt's work, which is in the permanent collection of the Met, MoMA, Guggenheim Museum, Whitney, just to name a few top Manhattan institutions. And he's in another 250 odd cultural institutions around the world. How do we engage a new audience with his artwork that would not necessarily, how do we break down those barriers to the art world? There is this sentiment, understandably so, that the art world can be elitist or exclusive. And, you read on Bloomberg or in New York Times that a Christie's or a Sotheby, sold people for 60 million plus, as an example. Well, as a new collector or novice collector, you see those numbers and think, oh, well, I could never afford it. So why would I even try to find a way to engage? That is something that's very dear to me. And that's a problem that Notable and other players are seeking to overcome by bringing newer collectors or collectors that may not be familiar with XYZ artists, the ability to see their works at a more accessible price point and in a digitally native format. And for those more, let's say, traditional collectors that would like to have a physical Hunt work, my philosophy is, when in doubt, offer them both. Why not have the digital and the physical? You get the best of both worlds.
It's a good question. How do you bridge that gap so that the traditional artists who are successful can become part of the digital economy, right? What do you like, other than just the price points and the type of product? How do you think that can be done?
It's really about the storytelling, and it's about cultivating a one-to-one relationship with the artist in his or her studio to realize their vision in the digital space. Now, there might be younger artists that are, say, more digitally native. Maybe they've done an NFT before or have done digital art or are considering doing it, so have looked into it. But those that are more traditional, let's say Hunt as an example, it's about the personal relationships that you have with someone like myself that comes from a curatorial art world background, that the artist, hopefully, and with Hunt, I'm delighted to say we do have a very wonderful rapport, that we work hand in hand with one another and the studio to realize the works in unique works digitally, and working with exceptional print partners, that the physical representations of those digital works are of sufficient quality, which they have to be, of course, to merit any price point, whether it's $200 or $1,500 or $3,000, that the artist is comfortable with, but also the potential collecting community knows that you're getting your money's worth when you buy a work validated by Notable by an artist like Hans Slonim, as an example.
I was going to ask about, hey, you answered the question about Hunt as far as him being a client, but how has this experience been so far working with him, and what can we look forward to as far as like that developing that community, or like what are some of the great things as far as the digital community that we could really, be part of his, collection and experience and join him and be really fans.
Yeah, absolutely. So with each NFT that one redeems, or which each NFT that with each NFT that one purchases, of course, there's the complimentary print, which I think is very crucial to feeling a sort of personal connection with the artist and his or her original work in his or her studio. But with each NFT and becoming a part of the notable art community, there are exclusive benefits, some of which I can happy to share, and some of which will be released over time. The opportunity to physically visit Hunt's studio and have a tour, as an example. Hunt and his studio have generously offered us 10 original paintings for, of the 1,000 odd units that we're doing in our first offering, 991 to be precise. 10 units will go out to 10 lucky buyers, 10 original paintings. I mean, how much closer can you get to the artwork than winning, so to speak, or earning, whatever term you want to use, the original painting as well? And then, of course, things like privileged access when Hunt has museum exhibitions, which he does both in the United States and abroad. Seems like there's at least one every month. He's so successful. Really, and of course, videos, podcasts with the artist, interviews back and forth with myself and the artist in the studio, to really have our collector community feel like they're engaged with the artwork. That's the most important thing. It's not something that sits in your crypto wallet and you have it as an investment and maybe you hawk it on OpenSeas as an example, in 9 months time or 2 months time or 2 days time. It's really about building that rapport. And one of the unique things that we're doing is these sort of twinned NFTs is once you redeem the original print, right, the museum quality print, the NFT which you now have serves as a certificate of authenticity that, of course, you can still show on your, Samsung frame monitor, for example, but can no longer be traded on the secondary market. So over time, we expect supply to, of course, naturally go down as collectors redeem their prints.
Makes sense. Sounds good. Notable art is really. Let's look at the back. Let me look at the backdrop. When I started my podcast 3 years ago, it was just when NFTs started. The NFTs just coming on, and then this had this just tremendous, hype cycle, where every JPEG was selling for $1 million. It seemed,
It certainly seemed that way, and some of them really were. More than a few were actually doing so.
Yeah, and then the NFT market took a hit, as well as the broader crypto market, right? But now you're revolutionizing the way that art is experienced, traded, and collected, right? So, what's different now as opposed to 3 years ago, and what's the evolution and revolution that you're going through to this next cycle?
So, of course, with the thawing of the quote unquote crypto NFT winter, there are some strong tailwinds, which we're all familiar with. Other indications of the potential for strong tailwinds, to be slightly more precise. But the distinction, I think, which what has evolved over the past 3 years is that hype cycle over, let's say, CryptoPunks as an example. I think investors were getting in and getting out as much as possible, and therefore there was this negative connotation that has since been attached, let's say, more so by the traditional art collecting community with that term. Whether you want to use the term digital art asset, NFT, there in that sense, the terms are fungible. But working with visual artists, I think, is the key. That that there's an underlying physical practice as a first-time buyer of, let's say, a notable NFT, that there is a physical artist behind it. You can walk into the Metropolitan Museum and see his or her work. You have that complementary physical, and it's a little bit, it's about the storytelling, whether we want to say notable is bridging digital and physical art or bridging physical and digital art. It's a little bit of a subtlety depending on the audience. For the more, let's say, Web3 native, crypto native audience, it's about you're more used to the digital, but you get this wonderful benefit of the physical and engaging with the artist as being part of the art collecting of the notable art community. On the other hand, if you're more a Web2 native traditional collector that maybe has not purchased an NFT before or doesn't have crypto, we provide a couple of things. One, of course, a fiat payment gateway. So you don't need to have ETH or Bitcoin in a wallet. And we will be launching in a couple of weeks' time a notable wallet, which is a Web2, a more familiar Web2 interface, standard email, password, two-factor authentication. So you never need to worry about, oh, do I have crypto in my wallet? How do I access it? You just go on notable.art and log in as usual. So it's really about trying to appeal to both traditional and digitally native audiences. And of course, this emerging collector base who are more digitally native, but want to engage with the traditional art world, but haven't yet been able to do so because there hasn't been that bridge.
Right. That makes sense to me. Awesome. So there's going to be more digital collectors. There's going to be more digital collectors, right?
Absolutely.
I want to find out, what that global appetite for digital assets backed by real world assets are, as opposed to just NFTs that are backed by the strength of community. Are there synergies there? What's the appetite going to be, going forward for the expansion of, real world assets backing digital assets?
Absolutely. I mean, I've personally seen, and I think, well, one, at the outset, I believe there are significant applications for wider blockchain technology to back physical, particularly luxury good real world assets, whether they're wine, watches, jewelry, of course, art we've spoken about, and that's what's getting the most attention in sort of the media and the sort of discourse, the wider discourse. But if you take the example of LVMH has launched a consortium called Aura with other luxury brands, of course, under the LVMH umbrella, but Mercedes-Benz, Prada Group have all signed up to start backing some of their new products with blockchain technology that will allow you to see, the consumer to see, sustainability of origin of the input products, whether it's sustainably sourced leather for an Hermes handbag, which is becoming, as an example, is that sustainability factor is increasingly important to younger consumers of luxury goods products. Also, then being able to trace authenticity and provenance from the point of production to the primary market when you're purchasing at the store. But even more so, of course, on the secondary market, and we've seen luxury goods, handbags, watches, wine, and jewelry booming on the secondary market, not only at auction, but through other outlets like The Real in the United States, for example, and other luxury goods companies. For example, Rolex actually now purchasing Boucherer, a major retailer, to help support and validate their own secondary market. So the applications for blockchain technology there are, in one sense, fairly obvious. That there's always a fear if you buy something secondhand or vintage that it may not be, if you're not the astute collector or don't have the right advisor, that someone could be less than reputable, let's say. Being able to trace, and of course it takes time, right? Once things are put on the blockchain, there needs to be a certain number of there needs to be an exchange of hands of the good to be able to have a necessity to trace its origin, right? But if you take the wine market, the fine wine market as an example, which is well over $20 billion a year at the top end, just the very top end of the market, let's say $100 per bottle plus, you don't know the authenticity of the wine, really. There's that fear until you open the bottle. And that could be 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now. There is And there have been, more than a couple of stories for those in the wine market or interested in wine, of people buying huge collections, of, prominent collectors, very prominent individuals buying expensive bottles or expensive collections and finding out that they were inauthentic years later. The application of blockchain technology, if it starts from source at the vineyard, through storage, through wholesalers, through retailers, you're much more comfortable that that bottle of Dom Perignon that you're buying for your wedding anniversary from your local wine shop is authentic, because it's gone through so many hands in the supply chain, in the value creation chain, and then the supply chain to come to the end user.
That makes sense to me. You said a word there. I want to follow up on it. You said vintage.
Mm-hmm.
I read an article this morning put out by Quentin Telegraph, and they said, AI tokens are just all hype, right? And you could say the same thing about NFTs being all hype. But then you could also make your argument saying that provenance proves that not everything is just hype, that it's real, right? So what role do you think provenance is going to have going forward with these vintage and unique and authentic things? I mean, I might have explained it already, but how important is provenance?
Provenance in the art world has always been a major both issue, but always a concern in a positive way for collectors. If XYZ artwork originated from a very prominent collecting family, you have confidence then purchasing it, let's say a Sotheby's or a Christie's, for it having come out of XYZ collection, that it is authentic. And of course, the Christie's and Sotheby's specialists have validated it, and they provide warranties as well, that the work is authentic. The auction houses do, and sometimes galleries do as well. But without the lack of verifiable, often paperwork, physical paperwork, provenance, there is a concern among collectors, particularly around luxury goods like watches and jewelry. If something goes for servicing to Rolex and there's a service report, you're confident that your Rolex parts inside are correct. Oftentimes, collectors don't keep that. Now, being able to put those reports as such on blockchain means you have a significantly higher level of confidence that what you're buying is, in fact, sort of what it says on the label, so to speak. So provenance has always been key, but a lot of the concerns about provenance issues can certainly be overcome by the application of blockchain technology and tokenization.
Yeah.
At the outset.
So, you mentioned collectibles. Like during the last bull market, I bought a whole bunch of collectibles on Suite. I had to move it off that platform. I put half on my Tezos, and the other half on my Matic wallet. But the Matic wallet, something happened to it where I can't access stuff now, so I lost half.
We've all heard those horror stories too many times.
Yeah, I know. So that was the past of collectibles, right? What's the future look like?
I think the future is much brighter. I think having more Web 2 native wallet infrastructures, like what Notable is building as an example, has applications for a more traditional collectibles collector. Now, whether that's wine or comic books or baseball cards, it's sort of neither here nor there, because the application is the same. It will take time, and it's harder in a sense to take a bottle of wine that was produced in 1945 from Chateau Lafite Rothschild, now put it on blockchain, and everyone has that confidence that it's authentic. Well, it left the vineyard possibly 70, 80 years ago, depending on how long it was there. So it's really about partnering with producers, both artists luxury goods manufacturers, whether it's jewelry, etc., so that at the outset, from the point of production, there is a corresponding token. And then over time, over the years, and as it changes hands, as the good changes hands on the secondary market, there is that implied confidence that wasn't there before. You know, with contemporary artists, there's no reason why an artist couldn't take his or her existing inventory and put it on blockchain. I'm not saying let's create what we're doing with Hunt, you know, unique NFTs and use those originals as source works for generating new works. I'm just saying very simply, take your existing inventory and stock and put it on the blockchain so that in 6 years' time, when it's changed hands twice, that end buyer has confidence that it originated in the studio more than what's often a little sticker on the back with a serial number, maybe a QR code if you're lucky, but that QR code has no implication. Sorry, a barcode, not even QR code, a barcode, which was just part of the artist or the gallerist's normal inventory management system.
Got it. So you're in New York,
Yes.
and I know there's an event. I don't know when it is because I've only attended a couple of days of it in the past few years. But there's an event coming up called NFT NYC.
Yep.
Will you be attending that?
I will absolutely be there. I had the pleasure of going last year for the first time, and it's very encouraging to see, if I may be so bold, more traditional art world market participants, you know, the Sotheby's and Christie's and art galleries of the world, but even more so encouraging to see the traditional art collectors coming to these events, and by the same token, at the more traditional art world fairs, whether it's Art Basel Miami or Art Hong Kong or Dubai or European Fine Art Fair, you see much more NFT art than you've ever seen before, but more and more traditional collectors gaining exposure to that art in an environment which they're used to and comfortable with. So there's a certain level of comfort in buying an NFT at Art Basel from a prominent art gallery that my work, of course, market conditions are market conditions, and no one can predict that in any marketplace, really. But there's a certain level of excitement that's coming into the traditional art market by seeing NFTs in traditional art venues, and similarly in the more crypto native venues, seeing traditional art collectors and traditional art market participants coming to those events. And it's a matter of time, and it's a matter of education on both sides. And as more of that, the sort of hype NFTs are perhaps fall away on the secondary marketplace because there is an understanding or an implication that there's not necessarily a physical underlying value to the asset, I think we'll see much more engagement by traditional art market participants and traditional visual artists to get their work into the NFT space.
Sounds good to me.
Fingers crossed. Sounds good to me too. That's what Notable's all about.
Awesome. So that's going to sound like fun. You talked about that being a benefit, and I want to find out what are the economic and what are the personal benefits of building a digital art collection. Like, I've had a lot of guests on my show who told me about their experiences building digital art and creating digital art that has made a personal impact to their lives and the lives of people around them. What are some of them to you?
Absolutely. Happy to speak about myself personally and friends. A lot of my friends and clients from my days at Christie's and as a private art advisor, one of the biggest issues in art collecting is shipping, insurance, storage. Three sort of, and the biggest costs associated with owning and collecting works of art, right? Insurance is what it is. But if you move house, or you want to move things move artworks in and out of storage, or transport your artworks from one venue to another, loaning something to a museum, etc., the logistics and costs associated with that are painful, to say the least. If I had a collection of Hunt artworks, as an example, which I can show on my Samsung frame in my New York apartment, and then, oh, I'm over at my friend's place in London, wouldn't it be cool to show those works on those screens in his or her home? You have that ease of transport, of the ease of moving the works that you certainly don't have with traditional artworks. And of course, I mean, depending on the underlying NFT and the underlying smart contract, it can be shown in two places at once. So if you have a country home, for example, you can decorate your kid's bedroom sort of the same paintings in both places. You know, little things like that. But the wider implications on the logistics in the art world in general, there's huge opportunity there. I mean, think about just for a gallerist that is perhaps very prominent based in New York, but is showing in Art Basel, Miami. The costs associated, even for the top, commercially successful galleries, are extraordinary. Now, the barriers to entry for someone just out of, a master's program from Rhode Island School of Design and is starting an art gallery with their friends, you just don't have the ability to participate because the costs are so high. I see digitization, not just NFTs in general, but digitization as an ability to break down those barriers to entry for commercial participants, not just collectors.
Interesting. I'm gonna feel a little embarrassed asking this, but I think there's a parallel with what I'm about to say. I could be totally off base, right? 2007, a lot of ICO projects. You create a white paper, you got money, right? 2021 and 22, you created a JPEG, you called it an NFT, you got money.
Yep.
In crypto, there's this meme coin cat dog thing going on. You create a cat dog meme coin token, you get money, you get people to buy in. The underlying is the sense of community and belonging and like being a part of a club and social. I think that's like the theme. Like, how do you capture that? And am I right or wrong? How do you capture that? And what do you see that as applying to the world of traditional collectibles and art?
There's definitely a parallel there, Jamil. So give yourself credit where credit's more than certainly due. There is, when one speaks generally about the art world, you're speaking about a community of collectors. Now, they might be very specific about British Victorian pictures, which is increasingly a very small collector base for kind of obvious reasons. As communities grow older, there are fewer collectors for certain categories of any collectible, for that matter. In most instances, so creating and curating a community around whether it's a meme coin or an NFT or an NFT project, those are the ones where you'll see, I think, continued value and continued value appreciation. But a corollary to that, and where many, in my personal opinion, have failed, is there's no utilitarian value. You have that social aspect, that community aspect, but at a certain point, people do realize what is the utility, or ask themselves, what am I really getting for this? Look, if you're just being speculative, nothing wrong with that. To each, put it on red, put it on black. Maybe you win, maybe you lose. That's kind of how I look at that. But when you create a utilitarian value with a physical print, or the ability to move your NFT from place to place seamlessly, and being able to show you, Jamil, on my phone when we meet in person, this is my digital art collection, or show you on screen, it's very different than, taking the iPad around the house and trying to show artworks, right? And that's an easy thing to do. And similarly, when you think about, if you take as an example the Google Art Project, which really became huge during COVID, what they've done, and now, of course, those are not NFTs, but by bringing museum art collections online with albeit JPEGs and video walkthroughs, that allows people that would never have the opportunity to visit an institution in New York if you're based in Hong Kong, or if you're in pick a location and pick another location. The ease of accessibility, not from a price point, but to engage and educate from the classroom, for example, the implications are huge and only positive, in my opinion.
I agree. That sounds good. No, thank you for entertaining that question that you had.
Of course, it's a pleasure.
So I want to thank you, very much for your time today. I enjoyed speaking with you. I love this conversation.
As I did, Jimmy. Thank you.
I look forward to what you're up to next. I have one last question.
Please.
It's an easy one. How can people
Right.
find information about you and about notable art?
That's an easy one. One, check out Jamil's podcast, of course. But our website is quite simple, notable.art, where there's further information not only about Hans Slenum's offerings and other ones that we have in the pipeline, but also information about myself and the wider team, who are both art world experts, serial entrepreneurs, and technologists, all coming together to really try to build something that hasn't been done before, that we hope will be a benefit to both traditional art collectors, traditional visual artists, and those who are more Web3 native audiences that would love to engage with the traditional art world. And you can also find us on Instagram, on LinkedIn, and all the regular social media, all on our website, notable.art.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
It was the easiest question. Thanks, Jamil.
Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, and thank you to your listeners as well for taking the time. Much appreciated.